Today we're going to start our look at JavaScript. So I'll talk about JavaScript in a second. In case you weren't aware, the results of assessment 1 are on the web now. So you can go to the blog and click on that, and there's a link there. You need the last 4 digits of your ID. I think everyone has figured that out pretty much at this stage. If you look at the histogram I generated of the results, you can see that, well, it turned out the average mark was 51%. But that included 3 people, or even 4 maybe, that didn't take it. So of the people that took it would be a little bit higher. But that's roughly around, I mean, you'd expect something around that. But if you look at the histogram, you see that the class really kind of fell into 2 camps. The people that sort of got it and the people that didn't. Very often you see in an exam, you see sort of a curve where most people are in the middle somewhere. But for that assessment, people were either in one chunk or the other, really. And that's a problem. So there are most people, I think, are fine. They kind of have got the gist of things, and some people are still struggling a bit. But I don't know what they can do really, apart from maybe just go over some of the earlier things. One of the problems with doing stuff in HTML is that there really isn't sort of a half right. You know, you're kind of, it's either right or it's not, really. And if you're in an open book exam, you know, the threshold for wrongness is you know, going to be different again. It can be frustrating too if you're working in the lab and you're doing stuff wrong, but the browser is displaying it, so you think everything is fine, but in actual fact it's still not right. So sometimes the browsers aren't being very generous to you. But in HTML there is like a standard way to do it, and you'd be expected to write HTML that conforms to that standard. And now by standard I don't mean like a level of goodness, I mean standard as in like ISO 9 whatever. You know, and something either conforms to the standard or it doesn't. And you'd be expected to do stuff that conforms to the standard. In the labs, I show you, I'm showing most of you anyway already, I think, a website where you can submit your HTML to it and it'll scan through it and tell you whether it conforms to the standard or not. Some people were still struggling a bit with the nesting and putting the boxes inside boxes inside boxes. I think it's really important conceptually to grasp that. And I think some people are still struggling with that. I think until you sort that out, if you're one of those people, I think you continue to struggle with HTML. I think getting the structure right is really, really important. And there isn't much room for negotiation there, really. If you'd like to view your script, you can send me an email and I'll bring it to the next lab that I have with you, and you can have a look. You can see the kinds of things that you were doing wrong. For that exam, there was like, let's hope it all adds up to 100 now when I'm finished saying this. There was 10% going for having the HTML and the header and the title and closing and the body and closing the body and closing the HTML. There was 10 going for that. There was 40 going for nesting the lists. Now, there weren't really many marks, in fact I don't think there were any at all, going for, well, okay, like I had an ordered list and I had the list items, but it didn't work out. You know, it wasn't nested properly. But I mean, the nesting was the question, that was the question. It was an open book exam. You know, if you're not being given, if you're not being required to remember things, that's good. But it also means you don't get marks for stuff that you just, you know, brought with you. So people struggled with the nesting all right. There was 40 going for that. Then for the table, there was 10 going for having the table structure generally right. So having a table and TRs and TDs and stuff. Some people forgot to say it was a table, and that would have cost them that 10. And the headings in that should really have been THs. I mean, they were, I think from the look of them, they were clearly THs, should have been used there. So those 10 going for that. Having TDs and then bolding them isn't the same thing as having THs, and it's probably actually a bad thing to do aside from that. The image tag itself, there was 10 going for that. An image tag must have the img src equals the name of the file, then the width equals whatever, height equals whatever, you must have the alt, and you must have the slash at the end. If you don't have all of those things, it's not right. Some people would have got 5 for that because they were missing one of those things. I was fairly flexible. You generally, when you're an image tag, you just say width equals 100. You don't say 100 px, but I let people away with that. That's not a big deal. And then there were 4 row spans, and they were like worth 5 each. But basically everybody either got all of those or they got none of them really. There was very few people kind of got some right and others wrong. So you can consider there was 20 going for the row spans. And some people I think were thrown a little bit. Do I have a copy of it there? No. Some people were thrown a little bit by the table in that because some of the rows were bigger than others, they thought there was a row that wasn't there. But there was, I think, the main row and then the heading row, and then there was 3 rows after that. So some people had their row spans off. And generally they were off on all of them or none of them. So they would have kind of got that 20 or not. There's 1 or 2 people kind of slipped up and got some right and some wrong, but generally that didn't happen. So I think that all adds up to 100. So that's where the marks came from. So any questions on any of that, or any comment on any of that even? That's acceptable too. I didn't mean to be harsh in my comments that if you got less than 80 you should be disappointed or worried or whatever, but I genuinely think you should. You know, like that exam was very easy and you were able to bring stuff with you into it. And if you can't get stuff right under those circumstances, you need to go back and study the stuff a bit more and look at the structure. In HTML, it's all about the structure, and you need to understand how the pieces fit together. And so, it's a bit, in a way, it's very different from programming, but it has the same problem that even if you have the pieces, it's how they fit together is the issue. And with HTML, it's all about the structure and how you fit things together. And you're not expected to remember 1 million tags, you know, how many there are, whatever. There's no real value in that. But you do have to know how things fit together in HTML. That's what you're learning. And some people are still struggling with that a bit. Now, in fairness, most people are flying. I mean, loads of people got 80s and 90s. You know, 100 was a very popular result. Very common. It was obviously was popular. It was a very common result. You know, so most people are doing fine. But if you didn't do well in that exam, you can try to console yourself that it was a hard exam or that it was marked hard or that Colin is a bollocks or whatever. But none of that will get you where you need to get to. So if you didn't do well in that, you need to figure out what it is you're doing wrong and go fix it for when the big money is at stake. So that exam was worth 20%, which if you did well in it, it's a nice help because you're halfway to a pass already nearly. So it's nice to have that money in the bank. But it's certainly not a deal breaker for anyone. 20%, you know, well, it isn't a lot unless you've got 40. But you know, 20%, if you're not going now carrying on with that 20%, if you don't have that with you, there's still 80% to play for. So it's still all to play for. But you need to get what information you can from that experience and figure out what it is you do and don't know and go from there. So any questions on any of that or any comment on that? So anyone wants to see their script, you can just send me an email and I'll bring it to the lab and you can look at it at your leisure. But I'd say most people even know already now from what I just said what bits they went wrong at. Any questions? Okay, so what we're going to start looking at today is JavaScript, which is kind of the third phase now of this module. We saw HTML, and then we saw how to style HTML using CSS. And now we're going to look at how we add interactivity to a web page. So JavaScript is a programming language that can run on a web page. Now, if you're allergic to programming, you're really going to hate JavaScript. Okay, because I think if all of the computing people in the world got together and had a vote on what the world's worst programming language is, JavaScript would come out number 1 or number 2. There's some debate, but the only debate is whether it's the worst or second worst ever. Okay? Now, you're not going to be doing that much of it in this module, thankfully. Although, I'm wondering though, are all of you having to do, do you have to do it next semester? I think you do, so it doesn't matter. You can worry about that then. I'm not sure. Does everyone in first year do soft6008? We'll see. I'm not sure. Anyway, I digress. So, the first thing we need to know about JavaScript is that it's not Java. In fact, it's nothing to do with Java, really. It's just that when this scripting language came out, Java was like so cool. It was like Java, 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 Java. That's all you're hearing about was Java, 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 Java. I remember seeing a research paper published in a journal that says how to get published in a research journal, and it just had keywords Java, 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 and then the text was just Java, 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 and they published it. Just by way of a joke that, you know, Java was all the rage. So someone said, well, let's call our scripting language JavaScript, and then it'll be cool too. That's largely the extent of the connection between them. Java, as I'm sure you know, or do you know? Yeah. Java is a high-level programming language. An important thing about Java is that it's platform independent. Now, since I was at college, people were talking about high-level programming languages being brilliant because you write them once and then you can run them on any platform. But there was always some catch. Whereas Java really was the first time, well, you know, you write it once and it does run on any platform. And Java runs on a standardized virtual machine. JavaScript then is different. So it's a scripting language executed by browsers, and it's used to add interactivity to web pages. Now, it's fairly limited in what it can do, and with good reason. You don't want a web page to have access to all of the files on your machine, for example. That wouldn't be good. You go to some website and they can copy everything off your machine. You wouldn't want that. So it's limited because it's small, but also it's limited for security reasons. And so the code is executed in the browser. So as well as having a HTML file and a CSS file, you might have some JavaScript code. And then the browser, when it downloads that, runs a program in the browser. And it's fairly standard across all the main browsers. There was a time, I mean, even now I think actually, when people are writing JavaScript professionally, they'll have the gist of what they want to do. And then there'll be no, if you're running Microsoft Internet Explorer version whatever, then do this, else do this, and else do this. Now, we're not going to consider dealing with all the freaky old browsers out there and stuff. You know, those people can get with the program anytime they want. We're not going to wait for them. So we're just going to be dealing with, we're not going to deal with different browsers really. And so the code is embedded typically in the HTML file, or it can be linked to in a separate file. It is that it'll run then in any browser. So it's a program you can run in a web page. So the JavaScript for a web page then is included in the header and or in the body. You can have it in both places. Scripts in the head are usually sitting there waiting to be called. So you might have functions sitting in the header section and someone clicks a button and then it calls the code that's in the header. Whereas scripts in the body are executed when the page loads. No, JavaScript has variables, and you can declare them using a var. Or not. If you don't declare your variables in JavaScript, sure, what harm? It doesn't really mind. Until it all goes wrong, of course, and then it's your fault. The variable names in JavaScript are case sensitive. So number 2 with a big N and a big T and number 2 with a small n and a small t are 2 different variables. So you have to be careful. But you're probably familiar with that. What programming language are you using to learn? Java. And Java is case sensitive as well, aren't they? Okay, so that's, in some programming languages they're not, and so if you come from one of those languages, this can be frustrating. Java is not very strong on the types. Who have you got for programming? Right. And imagine in that module, imagine in Java people are talking a lot about types, are they? And is this an integer or a real or a string? Yeah? Yeah. Well, in JavaScript, JavaScript's very flexible, but in a bad way. So, you know, you can write JavaScript. The idea behind JavaScript was you could knock off code, you could, knock out code really, really quickly. So the people that designed it were kind of, well, we don't want to be dealing now with, declaring variables and types. And sure, if it's an integer or if it's a string, sure, what harm? Like, we know what you mean, kind of thing. And so that can cause problems. Sometimes you're dealing with a string and you're treating it like a number, and 9 times out of 10 it'll work. And then that 1 time out of 10, the whole thing will just keel over and die. And you'll be there for a couple of hours trying to figure out what's wrong. So although JavaScript is very, very loose with its typing, okay, you need to be strict with yourself to write code that'll work all the time. So you need to be bossier than JavaScript. And there's a few reserved words, but we won't worry too much about those. No. So let's have a look at our first example here. So what this page is going to do is it's going to greet you differently depending on the time of day. Now, one important point about a web page that has JavaScript in it is that it's still a card-carrying web page. You still have your HTML and your head and your title and your body and blah, 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 blah. You still have all of the things that a regular web page has. But you also have some code embedded in the page. You need to identify the code and separate it from the rest of the HTML document. Whether it's in the head or in the body, it doesn't matter. You need to wrap it up in this script tag so that the browser knows this is code and not content. So we say script type equals text / JavaScript, and then /script at the end when we've finished the code. Scripts in the header typically that you put functions in the header and call them. And stuff in the body will get executed as the page loads in the order that they appear. Now, these first 2 lines of code here. Here we're declaring a variable called d, and we're creating a new date object. And this date object is a way of storing the date and time. And we're putting that into D. Now, this date here is going to have in it the current date and time. So if we were to generate date right now, it would have 11:31 on whatever. Today's the 6th, 7th, what date is today? 6th. So D is now today's date and time, stored in some format. This getHours method that we're applying to D would extract from that date and time object the hour value. So if it's 11:31, it'll extract 11. If it's 10 to 6 in the evening, it'll extract 17. And so int HR there will hold the hour part of the time. So if we have to run it right now, it would hold 11. Just for the crack here, we're doing a document.write D. We're outputting the date and time just so we can see what it looks like. Just thought that'd be interesting to see what it looks like. Now, document.write is outputting stuff to the web page. So JavaScript can use document.write as the page is being loaded to output things. Now, the things that it outputs will be interpreted as regular content like HTML. So you can actually output HTML as well. And we're saying document.write br/. That's go on to a new line. Now, here's an if statement. So we have if, open bracket, and some Boolean condition, and then close bracket. And that's the start of an if statement in JavaScript. If you don't have those brackets, it won't work. It's that petty. So here we're saying if int HR is less than or equal to 11, which would be the case right now, we're going to do document.write B to begin bold, good morning, /B to end bold. So we're going to say good morning. So it'll write good morning, and note there that it's actually generating HTML. It's outputting HTML to the browser, and so the browser will display that then as if we had said date and time, whatever thing, and then good morning, and then how are you. And we'll see that in a second. I'll show you this running. If you have a bunch of statements, they would fit in there inside in the curly brackets. That structure is fairly familiar to you, yeah? Something like that in Java, yeah? You can have an else if, and here we're saying if hours is greater than 11 and hours are less than or equal to 16. Is that how you do an and in Java? Ah, you're laughing, so. In most programming languages, it's an and, A and D. So this is the Boolean and. Bar is R and asterisk. That's not an asterisk. Exclamation mark is a not. Incidentally, let me see what's wrong with this line. No, I wouldn't have a semicolon after the if. It's if whatever, do that. And then you'd have the semicolons inside there, one line after the other if you had more than one line. But you wouldn't put the semicolon after the condition because that would end the statement, which isn't what you want to do. It's not a syntax error actually, it's something just logically doesn't make sense. Any takers? Well, if you look at the structure of this if statement, if it's less than or equal to 11, we're going to do this. If it's not less than or equal to 11, then we're going to go to the next part of the statement and do this. But there's no reason here to check to see if int HR is greater than 11. If it wasn't greater than 11, we wouldn't be here. If int HR wasn't greater than 11, we wouldn't be in this part of the code anyway. We'd be in the first part that we're not in. So there's no reason to check there if int HR is greater than 11. You could just check that int HR is less than or equal to 16. But of course then I couldn't have shown you the end. So let's see if I'm still connected to the internet. And if I am, we can run that. So when I first ran this, it was 11:05, and you can see up the top there, it says Tuesday, November 6th, blah, blah, blah. And that's what the date object looks like. It has all that information in it. And the get hours will extract the 11 out of that. Hopefully I'm still connected. Yay! Now it's 11:36, and it's still saying good morning, obviously. I could make you all stay here until 12:01, and we can see if it behaves differently. But I probably won't do that. Now, any questions on that much? Any questions? Okay. I like this example a lot. What this program does is that it displays a random image. Now, not completely random, obviously, but from a set of images. So we reload the page, and every time we load the page, we'll get one of how many? One of 5. There's at least 6 anyway, because the first one is 0, and the last one is, I think there's a number 5 there as well. Okay, so there's 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So there's at least 6 images anyway. In fact, there are more. It goes as high as 6. So there's 7 images altogether. Now, you can do a lot with this simple piece of code. Oh, it's gone off by itself. Okay, great. No. So once again, if we look at the top there, we have bog standard web page. You have your HTML, your head, your title, /head, body. Hello there, BR. And now we're starting the script. So this will happen then as the page is loading. And the first thing we're going to do there is we're going to generate a random number. So there's a built-in function in JavaScript called math.random. And math.random, note the uppercase M by the way, that will generate a random number between 0 and 1. So it'll generate something like 0.62471 or 0.001329 or 0.7 blah 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 or 0.920156. If I'm not mistaken, it never quite gets to 1. So it might give you 0.99999999999 or whatever. So it generates a real number, and that's an important point, a real number between 0 and 1. Do you know what a real number is? If whole numbers are like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. But when we talk about a real number, we're talking about like a floating point number where you've got a decimal. So numbers with decimals are stored in computer systems very, very differently from whole numbers. Internally, they're stored very differently. But anyway, all we're interested in is that we've got a random number between 0 and 1. Something like, well, we see. Now, if we take that random number, which we've called rand there, and we multiply that by 6, well, then you're going to get a random number between 0 and 6. You had a random number between 0 and 1, and now you've got a random number between 0 and 6. Does that make sense? So if the math.random had generated, for example, 0.47586, and you multiply that by 6, you'd get 2.85 whatever. So we have a built-in function that gives us a random number between 0 and 1. And then we can do some maths on that to get any range that we want. If we wanted numbers between 0 and 26, we take the number that's between 0 and 1 and multiply that by 26, and then we'd have something between 0 and 26. Now, math.round will round out a real number to an integer. So if it was 2.8, it'll round it to 3. There are two other rounding functions you can use as well, the ceiling and floor. Ceiling will always round up and floor will always round down, irrespective of what the numbers are. So ceiling of 2.1 would be 3, and floor of 2.9 would be 2. Whereas round just rounds up or down, whichever is closest. And depending on which one you use, you will or won't get the 0 and the 6. So my int then could be a random number that's either 0 or 1 or 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 or 6. But it'll be a whole number. No. This part now is the head rec, okay? You need to visualize you've just had a double espresso there now and wake your brain up for about 3 minutes, because this bit here is tricky. So my int is the random number that we've generated. It's either 0 or 1 or 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 or 6. And what we're going to do now is we're going to display the image. And we do that using a bog standard image tag. We're going to say img src equals whatever. Now I've left out here the width and the height and the alt, okay? Because I didn't want to make it too complicated. But for this to be correct, your image tag would also have to have the width and the height and the alt. But I didn't want to put that in here because it's confusing enough. So we need to generate on the fly an image tag. So what I want you to do is I want you to write down this on the page now in front of you. Open bracket, img src equals quote page dash photo dash 03 quote, oh sorry, no quote, sorry, 03 dot jpg quote / and close bracket. So I'll say that again. Open bracket, the like triangle brackets there. Open bracket, img src equals quote page dash photo dash 03 dot jpg quote / close off the bracket. So if int was 3, that's the image tag that we want to write. So that's an example of what we want to output, what you've written down there now. But it gets a little tricky, and I'll explain why that is. The issue that's coming up here is that suppose like we're doing document.write, and the thing we want to document.write we're putting in quotes. But what happens if you want to put quotes in the quote? Like our image tag needs quotes in it. So if you're putting quotes in quotes, you need an escape character. And that's what that / is doing there. So stay alert now for 2 more minutes. So we're saying document.write, and we're starting to quote the things we want to output. Just fair enough. So we're doing img src equals. No. Here's where it gets a bit tricky. We want to output a quote. But if we say document.write quote img src equals quote, well, that's going to mark the end of that. But we don't want to end the quote. We don't want to end what we're outputting. We want to put a quote in the quote. So that's what that slash is doing there. That slash is an escape sequence. And that's saying that the quote that comes after me isn't the end of the string. It's a quote in the string. So I don't want you to stop outputting here. I want you to output a quote. So what gets output then is img src equals quote page photo 0. And then that quote there is marking the end of that string. Next up, we're adding to that string my int, which in the example we looked at that we generated 3. So we're going to slap a 3 on there. Yes, sir?
Did you put my int after the JPG?
No, because then you'd have img src equals page photo 0.jpg 3, which wouldn't work. So we want to output the name of the image file, which is page photo 03.jpg quote. So that slash there again is an escape character to allow us to output a quote there to mark the end of the image file. So we say img page src equals page photo 03.jpg quote. Now you see here also I've done something I shouldn't have. I've used an integer there as a string. I've added an integer to a string and gotten away with it. So JavaScript allows you to do things like that. That's not to say it's a good idea. And then the end of the string actually appears there. So now if we go back to the one where we can see them all in one go, it makes a bit more sense, I think. And then we're also going to do document.write, this is image number whatever. So anybody got any questions on that? Go on, go on, go on, go on, go on. Yes, sir.
Do you need the 2 BR slashes at the end?
No, that was just to make it look nice. But the important point is that with the document.write, you're outputting HTML. You're generating HTML and sending it to the browser for display. Any other questions? Now, using the integer here as if it was a string is bad practice, really. You probably shouldn't do things like that. And there's a function you can use to convert an integer to a string, and a function you can use to convert a string back to an integer. But I thought this was busy enough now without adding more to it. And for this to be correct, you'd also have to output your width and your height and your alts. And so we'd get something like img src equals page photo 03.jpg. Yes, sir?
You know, after that, would you put the width and the height and the alt, or would you put it after the JPG?
Yeah, it would go in. Well, actually, it can go in anywhere after the image part. Anywhere after the image, any of the attributes can come along. But typically we do source, and then we do width, height, and alt. So you'd have to say, and you see again, you're outputting in the document.write. So if you want to say width equals quote 100 quote, you'd have to add to that width equals slash quote 100 slash quote. So you can put the quotes inside and the output. So an interesting thing you could do, for example, is you could take the two examples you have there and sort of merge them, and you could display a different image depending on the time of day. So if you had 5 or 6 images of the Eiffel Tower, for example, you could have one for the morning, one for the middle of the day, one for the evening, one for the night time. And then depending on what time it was, you could display the appropriate image of the Eiffel Tower. Or depending on what month it was, you could display your web page in a different way. But actually you'd probably do that with a CSS. You know, if you wanted to, if CIT wanted the My CIT website to be Christmas themed from December 10th on or something, you do that in the CSS file. You wouldn't really be doing that in the HTML. So you could experiment and do something like that. Now, the time that will be used is the time on your machine. If we had pictures of Times Square in New York, and we had a morning picture for Times Square and an evening picture, an afternoon picture, an evening picture, and a nighttime picture, the time that's going to come out of the JavaScript is the time here. But it can get a bit confusing because for 6 months of the year, the standard global time, the reference time, Greenwich Mean Time, that you use for web time, and our local time are the same time. So sometimes when you're working with them, you're not clear which one you're using. Because actually, for most of the time, you'd have to worry about it. You're on your summer holidays. So it doesn't come up. But if you were taking this class in California, you would probably have to be thinking all the time about, okay, am I dealing with the local time or the time on planet Earth? Like global time, Greenwich Mean Time, would be 8 hours ahead of California time. So you might be worrying about, is it this time or that time? Should I be adding 8 or subtracting 8? For us, I don't know if it's a good thing or a bad thing, but for most of the time we need to worry about it, they're the same thing. So we kind of dodge that bullet a lot. It's a pity we didn't do this class just before the clocks changed, and we'd have seen whether it was giving us, what the JavaScript was giving us, the local time in Cork or the time on planet Earth. But I'm fairly confident that it gives us the local time and that the program behaves based on the local time. So if you were doing something that required, let's say you're releasing, well, it would depend. I mean, if you're releasing an album at 11 o'clock local time, then the local time would be fine, no matter where someone is. But if it's, if tickets are going to go on sale from one website at the same time for everyone on the planet, then you'd need to be dealing with the global time, and you can get that from somewhere. But anyway, that's not important, okay? Don't worry about that. Any questions on that? So that's JavaScript. So we're going to start looking a bit in JavaScript. And JavaScript then is the third piece of the puzzle. So we have HTML, which is assessment 1, CSS, basically assessment 2, and then this JavaScript is going to form the bones of assessment 3. We're going to give you very, very little JavaScript, but it's still worth 40%, which is quite a lot. But that's the way it is. That's the way that the module is written. I'm not clear yet on how the assessment for the JavaScript will work out. Whether it'll be a thing to take away and do, like assessment 2, or whether it'll be an exam, like assessment 1. My preference would be for a take away and do thing, but there were problems last time around with people cheating and stuff. Not that people can't cheat in exams either, but so I'm kind of gone off that a bit. I will make a decision fairly soon and let you know. Obviously, if you're going to have an assignment to take away and do in JavaScript, you'd need to know that fairly soon so that you can go away and make a start on it. But either way, you need to be making a start anyway on JavaScript. So I'm going to be working on your web page for the cafe website, and on your JavaScript, and trying to divide your time between the two of them. You're not going, don't bother putting any JavaScript into your bank cafe assignment. That's just going to make things complicated. Don't do that. Just think of them as two completely separate things. Although obviously the HTML, the CSS, and the JavaScript, and later PHP on a server somewhere, they all interact then to give you something like what Amazon does. You need 4 pieces of the puzzle, in fact. Well, and databases is a 5th piece. But depending on what course you're in, what stream you're in, what you're going to be doing, ultimately you'll be dealing with the HTML, the CSS, the JavaScript, the PHP, and the databases, and they'll all be doing a song and a dance together to give you something fairly complex. But all we're interested in is the first 3 pieces. Any other questions? Oh look, it's so late, it's so late. We'll waste that 1 minute, will we? And just see that working. Oh, the tension. Someone ask me a question, please. I'm going to stand here clicking.
Why don't
Don't know Homer Simpson.
use the eternal clock to change it?
Because, first of all, that would take longer than a minute. But also, it's not as easy to do that anymore because the machines now connect up to the internet. Like when the clocks go back, I have to go ask my computer because I always get it wrong. And like as soon as I turn it on, it would connect to the Apple time server, and it would tell Apple where it is, and Apple would say the time now where you are is this, you know. So you can't fool your local machine for very long unless you disconnect it from the internet. Oh, only seconds to go. What's about now? I get booted out of the Wi-Fi, like. Okay, so just to prove that this program, this page, will behave differently depending on the time of day that I load it. Did that take longer than 7 seconds to say?
Yes,
I think it did. I think it did. Woohoo! Okay. Such excitement. The sad thing is, that might be the highlight of your day.
There's a good chance it is, actually.
Yeah.